It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Caroline, if I could start with you, as much as people think they know about 9/11 and remember it or saw it, I think they'll find this documentary series raw, tense, emotional, and startling. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to the subject and how you settled on the approach you took to depict that day in America.
I think what we wanted to do from the beginning was tell it through personal stories. So we were very, storytelling on the whole, it's hugely important to events like this, but personal stories in particular. So you can retell history through the major battles and the sort of alpha males of history and the various attacks that took place. But I think you only really get a sense of a real sense of what it was like to be there through personal testimony, and also, it was 20 years ago. It didn't. People didn't have the iPhones that they have today. If it had happened now, there would be a whole different range of footage available. But it was still a time where people had camcorders, people had stuff was being recorded. And so we had the opportunity also to make something immersive. So to make something that as much as possible gave you a sense of, what it was like to be there on the day, of, what Chief Pfeifer, what Heather Penney went through on that day. We'll never have that experience that they had, but the idea was to find that footage and then get the sort of original sort of rushes from it, right? So if you had a cameraman in the street, you weren't just getting what the news had shown on that day. We were going and asking for the whole, every time they press stop record, when they were running around, to as much as possible, so that people would know what that was like to when the towers collapsed, what the air was like, what the sound was like, and to play that out, and also not to have any artifice, right? Not to have any reconstruction that is often done in documentaries, which is fine, but it just wasn't what we were after. We were after personal testimony from people that let people speak, really stayed with them. And Heather and Joe will tell you that we had 3 cameras on them, which allowed us to stick with them, and we had them talking down the lens, so that you had almost a sense that you were sitting across from someone telling you a very, very intimate an intimate story. And that was how we thought we would approach this moment in history. Yeah.
I mean, apart from being very intimate and emotional, maybe I'll ask you about this, TJ. It's also pretty unflinching as a documentary when it comes to the horrors of that day. Perhaps no more so than when we see and hear the people who jumped. And I'm wondering, that's always been a controversial area in terms of how we in the media cover that or show it. And I'm wondering if you guys debated that or discussed that, about how unflinching you wanted this documentary to be.
I think unflinching is seen as a bad word. I think it's more about how do you capture these events with respect and a level of kind of cinematic sophistication. To echo Caroline's sentiments, the primary intent is to humanize the experience, right? So often events like these in nature become politicized, and over the course of time, we actually forget that humans were at the center of it. And ultimately, we start talking in statistics and we lose sight of the human narrative. So I think over the course of making the series, it was much more about the balance between, you cannot not talk about the tragedy, but in that same vein, in that same sentence, you're also talking about the triumph. And the way I kind of see it as a whole is a little bit more an exploration between human fragility and human resilience. And within that, you've got a wealth of experiences and nuanced kind of points of views from what people went through. So, to answer your question, it was always a matter of it should inherently be unflinching because that was the truth. But how do you make sure that you're preserving the integrity of the individuals who have been bold enough to share their experiences again with us, and do it respectfully, and do it with sophistication, and honor their narrative.
And just to give us a sense of what went into this, I mean, how many people did you speak to? How many hours of footage did you go through? Can you give us a sense of how you executed this?
Caroline, you could probably answer that better than I can.
Yeah, we interviewed over 50 people, and and those were sort of, you know, formal interviews. We also, I mean, we spoke with easily triple, quadruple that. And we went through, I think, over 900 hours of footage. So it was a lot. And I think the way that we started, I mean, the way that I started, the very first thing that I did was go through oral histories. And so a lot of organizations, sort of academics and historians, had the foresight to, in the very early days, just after 9/11, go and interview people and get their first person testimony, which was invaluable because 20 years later, that some of that detail is lost in the telling. So yes, people may have told their story over time, but often it will solidify into a kind of narrative that they tell. And so with some of them, you had the kind of raw telling of it, where people are still in shock, but they remember a lot. And when we interviewed people, I think what was unique about what we did also was the interviews were long. I mean, Joe and Heather will tell you, I'm sure, that they were particularly long. And that really was to help people kind of really bring us back to that day and to jog their memory. And it can't have been an easy experience, but I think also a lot of people told us it was, in a way, a sort of therapeutic experience. But I've lost the thread of your initial question. But
I'll turn to Heather. I mean, I think that answered it. That answered it well. Heather, you were an F-16 pilot on 9/11, and you were put in this, for most of us, would be this terribly frightening position, maybe impossible position. I wonder if you could describe for us your mission that morning, and what you were thinking as you were in the air over DC.
I was a lieutenant. Actually, yes, I was a young first lieutenant. I was just recently arrived at my first operational squadron as a wingman and had earned my combat mission ready status. But we were out of Andrews, based at Andrews, in the homeland. And when the towers were hit, we realized that our nation was under attack. Our unit was not an alert unit. There were actually not that many alert squadrons protecting our airspace at that point in time, because this is after the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and the incredible defense drawdown that cut the Air Force in half. So we were just average, everyday fighter pilots training to go to Operation Northern Watch and Southern Watch in bad guy land. So we're here at home in good guy land when we get attacked. We don't have any weapons on board. We don't have any missiles, no bombs, nothing like that. So when we were finally scrambled under the authority of Vice President Cheney, we were sent on a suicide mission. Mark Sasseville, who is my flight lead, he was our director of operations and really the senior leadership that day in the fighter squadron. And he was my flight lead. And he said, "Lucky, let's go." So when we ran off to our jets, we didn't have any weapons to use against any incoming airliners. And we believed at the time that there were up to 3 inbound airliners, one of which we were particularly searching for. We had been talking with air traffic control. We knew that one of the airliners had descended and had gone out of their radar coverage somewhere over northeastern Pennsylvania with a vector towards Washington, D.C. And we later found out that that was Flight 93. So when Sassonay took off that day, on what was, if we were successful to be a suicide mission, we were searching for Flight 93.
And
you know, Peter, I'd like to say something about how you opened up the question regarding, you know, something that being something that not, you know, that people might find terrifying or might be unable to do. But if you'll remember back to that day, I truly believe that any one of us, any American, would have made the same choice that I did.
the people on Flight 93 made that choice.
Exactly. Exactly.
You went on to serve 2 combat tours in Iraq. Did you have a sense when you were in the sky that day of how profoundly things had changed? That this was the beginning of war?
Absolutely. This was our era's Pearl Harbor moment. And that history actually was right next to me as we were scrambling to take off. I mean, I truly felt like this was a Pearl Harbor moment for our nation. And it was very clear that, having seen the images that everyone else saw on television that day, that we were now living in a completely different time.
Chief Pfeifer, if I could turn to you, initially when we're watching you in the documentary, you're on this what appears to be a routine call out, suspected gas leak. I'm wondering if you could briefly tell us how you happened to have a film crew with you that morning before anything had happened. But beyond that, then, the situation that you found yourself in as the first fire chief at the World Trade Center, and how you coped with the dimensions of what you were being asked to do.
That morning, it was interesting that we did have a film crew. I had Jules Naudet with me, and they were filming a firehouse of a probationary firefighter over the summer, and there wasn't a lot of fires. So it was just a routine gas leak in the street. Not too exciting for the film crew at all. And then at 8:46 that morning, we heard this loud sound of a jet coming overhead. And you never hear that in Manhattan because of the tall buildings. And I saw the American airliner pass by us along the Hudson River and then aim and crash into the World Trade Center. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't an accident. And I actually told the dispatcher that the plane was aiming for the building. And I asked for a couple hundred firefighters and our medical folks to go. And similar to what Heather was saying, our firefighters knew they were going on a dangerous mission, on the most dangerous fire of their lives. And they saw the gaping hole in the North Tower and the smoke coming out. And they made a personal decision to go in to rescue those that were in the greatest moment of need. And the firefighters came in quietly. They didn't say a lot. And I would tell them I want them to go up and to evacuate the building and to rescue those that couldn't get out. And that's what they did. They climbed the narrow stairs. And and as they were going up, they told people, don't stop, you could get it out, you could get out of here. They did some ordinary things, but it made a difference in people's lives. So I in my own memoirs, I call this, and we see it in the film vividly, as ordinary heroes, doing ordinary things, but at an incredible time in history. Whether it was firefighters going up or a pilot flying over the areas of Washington or New York.
And of course, one of these ordinary heroes was your brother. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your interactions with him that morning.
I thought my brother Kevin was off that day because he was studying for the captain's test. So he was a lieutenant in Engine 33. And that morning, he came up to me very quietly, and we looked at each other without saying a word. And we wondered if we were going to be okay. And then I ordered him, as I ordered many other fire officers, to go up and to rescue people. And he quietly turned around and took his firefighters from Engine 33 upstairs. And that was the last time I saw my brother Kevin.
I wonder, and I'd like to hear from, I guess, each of you on this. You know, it has been 20 years. I'm wondering, you know, what you think the meaning of 9/11 is 20 years later, with all that has happened in the interim. We're now at a moment where we are withdrawing from Afghanistan, country we went into immediately after 9/11 because of 9/11, and what we can continue to learn from 9/11. Maybe I'll start with you, Heather.
You know, I'm really drawn to what Chief Pfeifer said about ordinary heroes and ordinary Americans. And I think when we think about 9/11, it's too common to fall into the trap of sensationalism and fear and horror and the trauma of the day. And I'm not saying that that didn't happen or exist, but I would much rather the legacy of 9/11 be centered on the courage and the integrity and the heroism and the community and the sense that we all had that day, that we belonged to something bigger than ourselves, that we weren't looking out for, you know, number one, that we were trying to take care of other people, and the selfless acts that normal everyday people took to take care of each other so that we could survive and get through that day. I mean, there's this notion that the World War II generation is the greatest generation because average, ordinary, everyday people fought to literally save the world for freedom. I actually think that what we witnessed that day on 9/11 and the story that Chief Pfeifer told about his men and his brother going up the stairs into what they knew was likely to be perhaps the most dangerous or even the last mission of their careers. That's the kind of ordinary heroism and selflessness that I hope would be the legacy of 9/11. And that especially in today's world where we are so divided, living in echo chambers of our own algorithms and our own making, that we could remember that it's more important to have some compassion and come together and remember that we're in this together. And that it just takes us to look outside of ourselves and have a little bit more of that connection and community to tap into that ordinary heroism.
Chief Pfeifer, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, we remember these ordinary heroes and we say, never forget. And what we should never forget is the first responders coming together, our military folks coming together. But more than that, after the collapse of the two towers and the plane into the Pentagon and Flight 93 into the fields in Pennsylvania, what we saw was the United States coming together as a country. What we saw the entire world coming together. We felt this sense of unity, that we were in this together, and we had to speak out against such violence and terrorism. And I just remember going down the streets of New York, and people would stand on the corner and just applaud as the fire truck passed by. And I think that's what we need to remember, this sense of unity, especially at this time when we're so fragmented for so many different reasons. And if those heroes of 9/11 would look down, they would ask the question, why are we so fragmented when 20 years ago we were so united? So never forget what took place that day and the heroism and the courage, but never forget that we were unified as a global community. And when we come together, we can deal with any problems. And that's what we should always remember.
Caroline, TJ, I'm hoping that a segment of your audience doesn't remember because they were too young. And I wonder, you know, if they watch all 7 hours of this as someone who was a kid on 9/11, or perhaps even wasn't born on 9/11, what you hope that particular part of your audience takes away from this.
It's an interesting question. I never actually thought about it in that context, right? It's become such a part of our cultural fabric that you don't think of anyone who not necessarily hasn't experienced it, at least studied about it, read it about it, has seen. Now we have footage, which is our primary source of understanding the world. But honestly, I would still kind of echo Heather and Chief Pfeiffer's sentiments, which is that unfortunately, the events, 9/11 has become fodder for, you know, for political narratives, for whatever whatever incentive one political party might have to try to do to get a bill passed or whatever it might be, right? It's become kind of, it's become a tool for something other than what it was in many ways. And you know, I think my hope is that after watching this series is an opportunity to watch kind of, my big takeaway is selflessness. Is after collaborating on this, the amount of individuals that Caroline and the team and Daniel, who did a wonderful job interviewing a number of people a number of survivors who went through, you know, horrific events, but still the amount of times where the intent was to help first and not the intent to kind of save myself first is kind of astronomical. That was a surprise for me to see and it didn't come out in a place of, it felt like a genuine natural reaction was to help first, to move as a team, to look out for my colleagues, my peers, my friends, and together we're going to survive this thing. And so if you look at it through that lens and that context, I think my big takeaway, or the hope that the takeaway is also to look at how we clean up the aftermath. And what I mean by that is, you know, acts of violence and tragedy are inevitable. It's a part of the human experience. But how we react to it is the thing that I think what is the most, where 9/11 actually shows a sign of human resilience, human compassion, and selflessness in the face of tragedy. So, you know, this series in particular, I think there's something else to be made, probably that's a little bit more about the geopolitics of it. But in this case in particular, for those who were too young to experience it, I hope that's their main takeaways, is to understand that no one knows how they would react under certain circumstances, but at least these individuals who went through these events have showcased a real sense of heroism, which I derive a lot of pride from, just as being a fellow citizen.
Well, that seems like a perfect note to end.
Well, I was going to say, to add to that is just, you know, we didn't set out necessarily to find those. So what we set out to find was what do people do? An extreme act of violence happens, and how do people react? What moral decisions are people making? What does humanity do in these moments of intense, of crisis, right? Of stress, of violence. And you know, we didn't just pluck out the ones where people were behaving the best. That just was genuinely the overwhelming response. And you know, thank God, because it would have been too depressing otherwise. Because when you were sort of, you know, before we started, Peter, and you were sort of saying, I'm going to ask you about the meaning of 9/11, my instant reaction was, I don't know. What is the meaning of 9/11? I don't know what the meaning of 9/11 is. But I kept thinking of, there's in episode 3, there's a woman we interviewed named Daphne, and you can see her in the footage, and she's told, so she's covered in dust, and she's told on camera what's happened, what she's just lived through. So she has no idea that planes have been hijacked, they've gone into the buildings, and at this stage, the world does know, so news knows, and she's being interviewed about what happened, and she's sort of being told, and she's going, what? You know, it's this amazing bit of footage. And she says, you mean to tell me this building fell senselessly, people died senselessly? And so when you asked that question, that line came to mind. I thought, yes, it's senseless. I mean, it's all these acts of violence, they're senseless acts of violence. And when we were interviewing Marvin, who's in episode 4, and he is this lovely man, a paramedic who's at home, and he's being fed through a tube in his stomach. He can't swallow anymore. He's got cancer. And you're thinking, you know, why does this lovely man have this? Why is he struggling through this? And so I suppose, I hope what people take away from that is that these acts of violence, they are senseless. And the comforting notion that everyone here has just been talking about, that when we set out to look at what human beings do in those moments, it was overwhelmingly positive.
Well, thank you. A second perfect note to end on. It's been a great conversation, and thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.